My topic today is ruined magnificence, St Andrew's Cathedral after the Reformation. Perched on the east coast of Fife stand the remains of St Andrew's Cathedral. Once upon a time, Scotland's largest and most important church. During the Middle Ages, St Andrew's Cathedral held the shrine of the nation's patron saint, was the base for the kingdom's senior archbishopric, and was home to a priory of Augustinian canons. The 15th century writer Walter Bauer, who was for a time a canon at St Andrews, described the great cathedral as the lady and mistress of the whole kingdom. Today, partly as a result of the events of the Scottish Reformation, there are only fragments of the cathedral's medieval splendour. Yet we are also missing elements of the cathedral's later history, a winding pathway which I want to explore over the next few minutes. There is a long tradition of regarding St Andrew's Cathedral as a scene of ruined magnificence. When Dr. Johnson visited St Andrews in the 1770s, he noted, "In the morning we rose to perambulate a city, which only history shows to have once flourished, and surveyed the ruins of ancient magnificence, of which even the ruins can't long be visible, unless some care be taken to preserve them. And where is the pleasure of preserving such mournful memorials? The cathedral, of which the foundations may still be traced, and a small part of the wall is standing, appears to be in a spacious and majestic building. Of the architecture, the poor remains can hardly exhibit even to an artist a sufficient specimen. It was demolished, as is well known, in the tumult and violence of Knox's Reformation." While historic Scotland now do preserve some of these mournful memorials, many still have the impression of a site which has largely been abandoned since the 16th century. Indeed, historic Scotland's own statement of significance for the cathedral claims that with the death of the last pre-Reformation sub-prior, John Winram, the priory buildings are abandoned. Yet the reality was a little more complex. We get hints of this in Dr. Johnson's own account. While wandering among the religious buildings, Johnson and his friend Boswell came to two vaults over which had formerly stood the house of the sub-prior. One of the vaults was inhabited by an old woman who claimed the right of abode there as the widow of a man whose ancestors had possessed the same gloomy mansion for no less than 4 generations. The right, however it began, was considered as established by legal prescription, and the old woman lives undisturbed. She thinks, however, that she has a claim to something more than sufferance, for as her husband's name was Bruce, she is allied to royalty, and told Mr. Boswell that when there were persons of quality in the place, she was distinguished by some notice. Dr. Johnson presents this incident as an eccentric old woman dwelling in a collection of old vaults. Yet as we shall see, the widow of Mr. Bruce was far from alone in making the cathedral her home. In the centuries that followed the Scottish Reformation, the cathedral precinct had a variety of domestic, industrial, and recreational purposes. However, this later history is largely overlooked, and physical reminders of it have sometimes been deliberately erased. To understand this multifaceted story, let us start with the moment of crisis itself, the attack on the cathedral in the summer of 1559. There is no doubt that this was an extraordinary moment. In June 1559, Protestant activists inspired by the preaching of John Knox, descended on St Andrew's Cathedral, determined to remove the monuments of idolatry. Reformist activists stripped the cathedral of its furnishings and encouraged the members of the Augustinian Priory to reject Catholicism and join the Protestant congregation. In a letter written that same month, Sir James Croft informed the English government the Scottish reformers had put down the prior of St Andrews in this sort, altering the habit, burning of images and mass books, and breaking of altars. This was a turning point in the cathedral's history. And from this period onwards, the cathedral church ceased to fulfil its medieval religious functions. But it wasn't the end of the citizens of St Andrews' use of the wider cathedral precinct. The Scottish reformers adopted an interestingly nuanced approach in their treatment of former monastic sites. The first book of discipline decreed in 1560 that abbeys, monasteries, friaries, nunneries, chapels, chantries, cathedral kirks, canonries, colleges, other than presently our parish kirks or schools, were places of idolatry and must be utterly suppressed. But it also noted that many of these sites' ancillary buildings, such as palaces, mansions, and dwelling places adjacent thereto, with orchards and yards of the same, could be allowed to survive. This two-part policy was key to shaping the post-Reformation evolution of St Andrew's Cathedral. Let's begin with the fate of the cathedral church. As St Andrew's already had a parish kirk, namely Holy Trinity on South Street, the main cathedral church was deemed a place of idolatry and allowed to fall into ruin. Indeed, the citizens of St Andrew's actually helped it become a ruin by removing masonry for other purposes. This process took place within a few decades of the Reformation. By the 1580s, the Gedi map of St Andrew's shows the cathedral as a roofless shell. Meanwhile, in the 1620s, Habakkuk Bissett sadly commented on the old ruinous walls of the cathedral and sometime most magnificent kirk of the Archbishopric of St Andrews. A few years later, in the 1630s, Charles I did consider rebuilding the cathedral church. In 1634, he sent instructions for the remains to be surveyed, stating that, being resolved to re-edify the cathedral church of St Andrews, our pleasure is that you, with our masters of work and such others as ye shall find to be understanding men in architecture, in presence of the Archbishop of St Andrews, survey the vestiges of the said church, and how the same may best be helped or of new built. This was probably a serious plan. Charles did actually undertake significant work at Holyrood Abbey. However, the difficulties of the mid-17th century disrupted Charles I's architectural ambitions. By the 1680s, the cathedral church seems to have looked much as it does today. The antiquarian and church administrator George Martin noted then that this church, while it was entire, had 5 pinnacles and a great steeple on the top of the church. Of these pinnacles stood 2 on the west gable, where was an entry to the church. One of these fell immediately after the people, coming from a burial, had passed by under it, but without hurt to any person. Upon the east gable of the cathedral church, which is yet entire, there stand 2 other pinnacles or turrets. Where the main and cross church did meet, there were 4 pillars, which were greater than the rest. Upon these great pillars stood the chief steeple of the church. But that, and the walls of the church, and the pillars whereupon it stood, being totally demolished, no account can be given either of the height or the figure thereof. But this picture of collapsing masonry does not necessarily hold true for the wider cathedral site, as we see from Martin's own writings. In his same History of the Bishopric of St. Andrews, Martin described the Cathedral Cloister. He stated that the cloister is a quadrangle, and of old was the great marketplace of that renowned fair of St. Andrews, called the Sensi Market, whereunto resorted merchants from most of the trading kingdoms in Europe. The cloister is now turned into a little orchard, having the south side wall of the church for a part of its fence. So this is a place which is an orchard and was formerly a fairground. Now one might think that the Sensi Fair was some relic of the Middle Ages. Some scholars certainly have regarded it as a medieval institution. However, there is notable lack of pre-Reformation references to this event. Meanwhile, a charter by Mary Queen of Scots from 1563 appears to regard the Sensi Fair as an innovation. The Queen commanded a gift of yearly markets and fair to the provost, bailies, council and court of St. Andrews to begin the Tuesday next, immediately following Low Sunday, and to endure continually for 15 days, holden within the city, borough roods, commons and abbey of St. Andrews, for all manner of gear and merchandise. The Sensi Fair took its name from the nearby Sensi Chamber, formerly used for religious synods, and located on the west side of the Cathedral Cloister, in the foreground of this photograph. The Sensi Chamber remained in use as a meeting place following the Reformation. The Cathedral Priory existed as an administrative construct for a long time after 1560, although it was reduced in wealth and influence and no longer functioned as a religious community. In 1570, the members of the Priory's chapter agreed that they would meet twice yearly. The memorandum stating this notes that the brethren of the Abbey of St. Andrews, being chapterly gathered in the hall called the Sensi Chamber, all in one mind and voice concludes that in time coming, each year, 2 chapters general shall be holden within the said abbey. Yet the area of the cloister around the Sensi Chamber was more than just a meeting room. It was also a house. After the Reformation, the sub-prior John Winram continued to live here on the western side of the cloister. You can see this area of the cloister shown with a roof on the Getty map. After Winram's death in the 1580s, the house appears to have suffered some disrepair, but it was then developed and improved by a local resident named William Balfour. A grant by James VI in about 1600 declares that our sovereign lord and the estates, understanding that William Balfour, citizen in St. Andrews, has employed great sums of money upon the building and repairing of that lodging and yard, situated within the Abbey of St. Andrews, sometimes occupied by umquhile Master John Winram, which was ruinous and would have been empty, void and waste, if the same had not been built, repaired and upheld upon the sumptuous expense of the said William. Therefore has ratified the said William's investment of few firm of the said lodging and yard. The property was further restored and extended in the 17th century when it was owned by St. Leonard's College, who adapted part of the buildings to serve as a library. In the 1680s, George Martin stated that the Sensi House, Sensi Hall and Sensi Chamber, called the sub-prior's house, is a tolerable dwelling. It is yet entire and contains sundry rooms as hall and chambers, the charter house, a close stone rooms, a little old chapel sometimes turned into a stable. The room of old called the Sensi Chamber, upon the south end of the house, is now very much enlarged and well rectified, being made a large room 80 foot in length, 20 foot in breadth, windows to the west, with a chimney in each end, to be a library house to St. Leonard's College. By the mid-18th century, the dwelling in the cloister was in slightly less good repair. In 1754, when St. Andrew's University sold the property, it was described as that piece of enclosed ground and gardens, with the ruinous houses thereon, lying adjacent to the Abbey port, bounded by the pens of the said Abbey port and the highways leading from thence to the shore or harbour on the west and south, by the ruins of the cathedral on the north, and by the burial yard of the city, and the piece of ground and some old vaults and houses occupied by the heirs of Arthur Bruce on the east. Presumably, the Arthur Bruce mentioned here was a relative by marriage of the old lady Dr. Johnson met in the 1770s. The buyer of the Cathedral Cloisters, William Imrie, and his successor as owner, General Campbell, turned the area into a Georgian gentleman's residence, known as Priory House. You can see Priory House and its gardens in this image of the cloisters as they appeared somewhere around the year 1900. Particularly striking are the Victorian greenhouses abutting the south wall of the old cathedral church, and serving as a reminder that the reason why this section of wall survives is because it was serving as protection for the garden. It's a fascinating image of a densely utilised, intricate space, but it was a scene that was not to last. In 1893, Priory House was acquired by the Marquis of Bute, who set about uncovering and restoring St. Andrew's medieval remains. In 1897, the antiquarian David Hay Fleming informed a friend that there is little new about St. Andrew's since you left. Bute has taken down the stable and laundry at the Priory and shown in their place a lot of massive old foundations. He's also cut down a huge tree which obscured the view of the cathedral from South Street. It was an early engagement in a lengthy campaign by antiquarians and supposed heritage experts to erase the cathedral's post-medieval additions. In 1908, a cathedral museum opened, and in 1946, the cathedral and cloisters were acquired by the state, who rapidly set about demolishing Priory House, creating the much more open space seen by modern visitors. Yet the cathedral precinct was much more extensive than just the area currently cared for by Historic Scotland. It encompassed the land on the south side of the road we call the Pens, now occupied by St. Leonard's School. A wide variety of domestic, industrial, and recreational buildings covered this section of the precinct, several of which are mentioned in the 1597 grant made to the Duke of Lennox, then Commendator of St. Andrew's Cathedral Priory. At that time, not all of these properties were in good repair, but the Scottish Parliament seems to have hoped that reorganising property rights might encourage regeneration. The Act states that our Sovereign Lord and Estates of Parliament, understanding that the houses, buildings, granaries, orchards, yards, dovecotes, catchpools, so sort of tennis court, ball games court, cloister, and whole office situated within the bounds and precinct of the Priory and Abbey place of St. Andrew's, daily decays and becomes ruinous, in such sort that the same, by process of time, will utterly decay, to the great hurt of the policy of this realm, and to the prejudice of the inhabitants thereof. For remedy whereof, our said Sovereign Lord and Estates grants full power and liberty to his Highness dearest cousin Ludovic, Duke of Lennox, Commendator of the said Priory, to set in few firm for payment of such females as he thinks expedient, whatsoever particular part or parts of the place within the said precinct of the said Abbey. Probably the most high status of the buildings on the south side of the Pens was the New Inns, which you see on screen, and in the 1530s here was the scene of Mary of Guise and James V's wedding festivities. An inventory from 1565 reveals that the property was still furnished then. Item, in the inner chamber thereof, a small counter of Dansk. Item, in the great chamber thereof, a cupboard of oak. Item in the chamber at the turnpike foot, a board of oak, with a bed of oak, but furnishing. Item in the over gallery, a forface of a press, with a press of fir and board. Item in the chamber thereof, an empty bed with 2 forms. Item in the high chamber, an empty bed of oak, with a Flanders counter, with a small iron chimney. Item in the Laird of Cleish's chamber, an counter, a bed, and a chair. Item in the Queen's outer chamber, a chandelier of brass. During the mid-17th century, the New Inns replaced St Andrew's Castle as the residence of the Archbishops of St Andrews. Indeed, Archbishop Sharp, whose portrait you see here, lived in some comfort at the New Inns. George Martin, who had served as Sharp's secretary, noted that the New Inns, Hospitium Novum, is the present house which hath belonged to and been inhabited by the archbishops ever since the annexation of the priory to the archbishop. It is very well in repair, and of late much bettered than formerly. The New Inns has now been demolished, although fragments of its gateway survive as an entrance to St Leonard's School. Of course, the cathedral precinct also included working spaces. The Abbey cornyard long survived the Reformation. An agreement in 1617 noted that feuars of priory acres, the fields to the south of St Andrews, should in future bring their own team sheaves to the Duke's cornyard within the Abbey of St Andrews yearly, with their own carts and at their own charges. The cornyard was accessed from the Teamed gates, which you see here. Interestingly, when St Leonard's School recently had building work, this was the entrance they sent the construction lorries through. The cathedral's priory's mills also continued operating. In the 1680s, George Martin commented that the Abbey Mill stands yet entire. The aqueduct or mill lade that carries water to this mill is near a mile long. This mill now pertains to the city of St Andrews, being fewed out to the magistrates, council, and community. The mills continued working throughout the 19th century and can be clearly seen on Victorian maps. In 1896, the architectural historians David McGibbon and Thomas Ross noted that the Abbey Mill, with the mill dam and mill lade, sluices, etc., are still in use. The Teamed barn still stands in the neighbourhood of the mill and is still utilised. It was only in the early 20th century that the Abbey Mill was demolished. However, the walls of the mill pond area are still clearly visible and it now forms a playground for the people at St Leonard's. To conclude, there are really 2 separate strands to St Andrew's Cathedral's post-Reformation history. One thread is the oft-repeated tale of a ruined cathedral church, of relics scattered, statues smashed, and masonry removed. As long ago as the late 17th century, when John Slessor created this engraving, the choir and nave of St Andrew's Cathedral looked much as they do today, a remnant of former glories. But this is not the only way to understand the cathedral site. As John Sletter's other engraving of the cathedral reminds us. This second view, also from the 1690s, shows the wider cathedral precinct when viewed from the south. It's a place of orchards, mills, homes, and education. People actively used this area. They adapted and developed it according to their own needs. This perspective of rebuilding and occupation is just as vital for understanding the site we see today as the familiar narrative of ruined magnificence. Thank you very much.